can a budget mic brand actually compete with one of the most popular pro microphone brands on the market? That's a big question that I know a lot of you out there are asking when you're looking for a good microphone for your content. So today I'm putting Fifine and Rode head to head across 4 different microphones to see if they can actually compete and which one might be best for you. I've put each of these mics through their paces with different audio tests so you can hear them for yourself and make up your own mind on which one you think sounds the best. Now Fifine did cover my production expenses to make this video, but it's not sponsored. All my opinions are my own. And like I said, you'll be able to compare the actual audio untreated from all these microphones to make up your own mind. So let's jump into it and compare these 4 different microphones. All right, so let's start out with just a quick overview of each of these 4 different microphones so we know what we're working with. So starting out, we have the Fifine Tank 3. Now this is a dynamic mic, and overall I've been really impressed with the build quality. It definitely feels solid. I really don't have anything major to complain about. I'm also a fan of the design overall. I think it looks quite nice. It's quite sleek. I quite like the dark color of the grill. It's easy to attach to any mic arms that you might already have. And then in terms of the onboard controls, you've got a mute button, gain and monitoring control knobs, a headphone jack so you can monitor directly, and then you can either output via XLR or USB. Next up, we've got the Profile 3 from Fifine, and this is a condenser mic. So this one feels, again, very well built for the most part. I'm not as excited about the design of this one. I think maybe just because it feels a little bit chunky for me, but it's definitely not a bad design. And I definitely appreciate that it comes with a desk stand included, so you can just mount it on your desk. You don't need to worry about getting any extra arms. In terms of on-mic controls, you've again got gain and monitoring control knobs. There's also monitoring controls on the front of the microphone. There's a headphone jack, and you've also got a high pass filter if you want to cut out any of those low frequencies. And this one is USB output only. There's no XLR option. Next up, moving on to Rode, we have the Rode NT USB Mini. Now this mic has a very small footprint, which I really like. It feels high quality, as all Rode products do in my experience. I also really like that it comes with an inbuilt stand for your desk. And this one is actually magnetic, so it's really easy to clip on and off. This one has less in terms of on microphone controls. So you've got a headphone output so you can monitor your audio, and then a headphone volume control. And then lastly, you've got a USB output. Also no XLR option on this microphone. And then last but not least, we've got the Rode Pod Mic. I have the XLR version, but you can get a USB and XLR version. This has honestly rock solid build quality. It feels like it was definitely built to last with a surprising amount of weight to it. I really like the design. I think it looks quite sleek and classy, but this one has absolutely no on-mic controls. If you want to adjust any of the levels, you have to do it all either on your audio interface or in post on your computer. So now let's get into the actual important part, which is the audio tests. I highly recommend wearing headphones so you can really hear the difference between these 4 mics. But let's jump into the first test, which was seeing how well these microphones handle plosives. Testing plosives. Peter Parker picked a peck of pickled peppers. 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 So for me, I think the Profile 3 probably wins this test. I found it was probably the best at cancelling out plosives. I'd say the Rode Pod Mic was the clear runner-up, and then the worst was probably the Rode NT USB. And I think it kind of makes sense because the Profile 3 has that bigger form factor, so I imagine it's got a better pop filter in that space, while the Rode NT USB Mini is a much smaller form factor, so it can't fit as big of a pop filter in there. Next up, we have a Sibilance test. Testing Sibilance. She sells seashells by the seashore. 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 All right, so for me, I think personally what I found to be the winner for the Sibilance test was the Pod Mic and the Tank 3. And I think that's because I found they both had probably the most well-rounded sound. This is what I started to notice in general. I think especially the Pod Mic sounds very well-rounded. It's not too heavy in any one area, apart from maybe the mids. I think the Tank 3 is also quite well-rounded, maybe weighted a little bit more to the high end rather than the low end, but they both seemed to handle those high frequencies really well, and they didn't sound harsh. On the other hand, I think for me, the worst performing was the Profile 3. It felt like those S sounds were just a bit harsh. To me, it kind of makes sense because it feels more weighted to the low end. It feels bassier with the Profile 3, but of course, this is all just my opinion. Feel free to leave what you think in the comments. Next up, we have a bass or low end test for these mics. Testing low end. Bold, broad, booming bass. Bold, broad, booming bass. Bold, broad, booming bass. Bold, broad, booming bass. All right, now for me, the clear winner was the Profile 3. And you might just say, oh, that's just because it's the most bass heavy, so of course you're going to say that. But I actually think it's not just the fact that it is bass heavy, which it is, I grant you that, but I think it's also fairly clear in the bass. It's not too muddy and it's not overly bassy. It's not too heavy if you ask me. And I think the midtones aren't too bad. So when you combine everything, I think it has a pretty decent sound, especially if you're looking for a microphone that sounds a little bit warmer, a little bit richer. Then I think the Profile 3 wins in that regard. I think the worst performing in terms of that bass, that low end, is probably the Rode NT USB Mini. And I think it's because it just feels a little bit muffled in those low end frequencies. It doesn't seem quite as clear as the Profile 3. And then again, I think the Tank 3 and the Rode Pod mic sound pretty well rounded. So out of the box, they don't quite give you that same bass that these other two microphones do. Next up, I wanted to do just a bit of a normal speaking test, how these microphones sound when you're just recording something like you normally would. This is what my voice sounds like in a normal conversation. I'm speaking at a typical volume as if I were recording a podcast or voiceover. This concludes the microphone test. This is what my voice sounds like in a normal conversation. I'm speaking at a typical volume as if I were recording a podcast or voiceover. This concludes the microphone test. This is what my voice sounds like in a normal conversation. I'm speaking at a typical volume as if I were recording a podcast or voiceover. This concludes the microphone test. This is what my voice sounds like in a normal conversation. I'm speaking at a typical volume as if I were recording a podcast or interview. This concludes the microphone test. All right, so my take on these recordings is, first of all, the pod mic. This sounds, again, really well rounded, which I quite like, but a little bit mid-heavy. I found the mids a little bit muddy, but it doesn't feel like it's too weighted in one direction, which is kind of nice if you want something that's quite neutral. Now the Tank 3 I found was similar. It's fairly well rounded, but it feels a little bit more weighted towards the high end. So that actually could be really good if you've got a very deep voice and you want it to be a little bit more even. However, one thing that I did notice, which I'm going to talk a bit more about later, is that I noticed there was a bit of a background hiss coming through the Tank 3. And it's interesting because I only noticed it when I was recording with USB. Anytime I recorded using XLR, that hiss was gone. And I've noticed that in other Fifine mics in the past. I didn't notice it on the Profile 3, but it's definitely there on the Tank 3. So that's worth keeping in mind. Now, when it comes to the NT Mini, to me, again, this sounds a little bit more weighted towards low end, but I found the midtones to be pretty clear. It didn't sound too muddy, which I quite like. So I think out of the box, this gives you a pretty decent sound, especially if your voice isn't too high pitched or too bassy. And last but not least, the Profile 3. I think this sounded a little bit weighted towards the bass, like I mentioned previously, but I think it actually still had pretty decent mids and highs, especially the mids. You might need to EQ the high frequencies down a little bit because it did lose that Sibilance test. But I think overall out of the box, it actually sounds pretty decent. I feel like it matches my voice pretty well, but I would still want to EQ it a little bit. But that said, I think overall, in terms of the speaking test, I almost wonder if the Profile 3 might win it for me. But again, let me know what you thought in the comments. Next up, I did a bit of a proximity test. So I wanted to see how well they would reject sound from either side of the microphone. And then I wanted to see how they sounded when they were really close to my mouth. And then we're going to do another proximity test. So this is how it sounds from the front. And then if I go around to one side, this is the left side, I'm relatively close. This is how the microphone sounds. Then if I come back around to the front, and then I'm just going to bring it really close to my mouth just to see how it sounds really super close up. Once again, you probably typically wouldn't have it this close, but maybe you would. And then I'm going to do the proximity test. So I'm going to bring it around to one side of the microphone. This is the left side. And then if I bring it really close to my mouth, this is how it sounds really close up. So you probably wouldn't have it this close with this kind of microphone, but maybe you would. So this is how it sounds when we go around to one side and behind, and then coming back to the front. So this is how it sounds when it's up quite close to my mouth. This might be how you would typically use this kind of microphone. Now let's do a quick directionality test. So this is what it sounds like if I go over to one side and behind and then back around to the front. And then for a proximity test, let's bring it up really close to our mouth. And this is how it sounds really close. This is typically how you might use this kind of microphone, quite close to you. All right, so I'm very curious to hear what you guys think. I think for me, I found it pretty hard to pick because they all seemed pretty decent when it came to sounding even. I think the main thing that I did notice was that the Profile 3 probably had the sharpest drop off. So when I went beyond about here on the side of the microphone, it really dropped off, which could actually be a good thing because that helps to reject any background noise in your environment. But overall, I think I found them pretty even when it came to proximity and rejecting noise. All right, the last test I wanted to do was how they handled background noise and how well they rejected it. And for reference, in these tests, I had my office window open and there was some construction noise going on outside. Plus I had my NAS running on my desk, so that was also adding some background noise. So that's what you're hearing when I'm being silent. Testing background noise. Testing background noise. Testing background noise. Testing background noise. All right, so I found the results of this test pretty interesting. For me, I think the Tank 3 was the winner, but with a caveat. I found that this cut out the most amount of external background frequencies, especially a low hum that was coming from the construction site across the road. However, again, recording via USB, it introduced some hiss. So that kind of canceled out the background noise rejection, which was pretty annoying. However, when I used it with XLR, it was excellent. So if you're using it with XLR, the Tank 3 is the winner. And then I think the runner-up was probably the Profile 3. I think this did a pretty decent job of cutting out background noise as well. I found the Rhodes weren't quite as good, which I found interesting. All right, so let me just give you a quick overview of my thoughts in general of each microphone. I think the Tank 3 is the one that surprised me the most. I like that it's fairly well rounded. I kind of wish that it was a little bit more bassy for me, but it does really handle background noise rejection really well if you've got it plugged into XLR. And I do really think it's actually a pretty solid option, especially because I actually kind of like the sound coming out of this with no EQ over the Rode Pod mic, which is the microphone that I typically use in all of my videos. Next, the Profile 3, like I said, I think this one was the most flattering to my voice overall. I was really impressed with how it handled plosives, but again, the highs did sound a little bit harsh and could require some EQing, but I think this would be a really great choice if you're doing voiceover work and you want your voice to be really warm, because I think this is a mic that you really would need to have pretty close to you to get the best out of it. Next, the Rode Pod mic. Like I said, this is the mic that I generally use myself. And I think I still like the fact that it's very well rounded. It's very neutral. So you can kind of push it in whatever direction you want to in post. But I think if you're looking for something that will work out of the box, that doesn't require any equalization, then maybe the Pod mic might not be the best choice for you. But then of course, it's got that really solid build quality and this will last a long, long time. And then lastly, we've got the Rode NT USB Mini. And this one didn't win any of the tests and it kind of just did okay across the board. It didn't really stand out in any one category for me that much, but I think the big thing that this has going for it is the small form factor. So you can put it on your desk out of the way really easily. And it's just really easy to use. It's plug and play. You don't have to worry about any extra controls. So that's worth keeping in mind. All right, last but not least, who are these different microphones best for? I think if you're looking for plosive control, you want something that you can hold close to your mouth and get really good audio from, the Profile 3 is for you. If you're in a noisy environment, there is background noise and you want something solid for that, go the Tank 3 if you're going to record via XLR. If you want something that's going to give you warmth and richness with your voice, that's kind of your preference or your style. Again, I think the Profile 3 is a really great choice. Next, if you want something that's highly customizable, that you can really dial in to how you want it to sound, that will match your particular voice, I think the Rode Pod mic is still a really solid option, especially with that build quality. It's very hard to go wrong. And lastly, if you just want plug and play simplicity, you don't have to worry about gain controls or volume or anything like that, the Rode NT USB Mini might be a really good choice for you. Like I said, keep in mind that the audio quality maybe isn't as good as the other three mics, but if that's not a concern for you, then it's worth checking out. So let me know in the comments which microphone sounded best to you. Which microphone are you going to go with? Which one are you currently using? Did you guess which microphone I'm currently using? If you didn't, it is the Fifine Tank 3. I've EQ'd it to my voice, so I think it sounds pretty solid. If you want to check out any of these microphones, there'll be links down in the description, so make sure you check that out. If you'd like to see another comparison between three popular brands, including Fifine, Rode, and Shure, then check out this video here where I did a full comparison to help you narrow down which microphone might be best for you.